Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on creating an engaging donor newsletter. My name is Kiara Frechette. I'm the Nonprofit Programs Director here at Spur Local. I'm going to give people about one more minute or so to log in, and then we'll jump right into things. Thanks for being here. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, my name is Kiara Frechette. I'm the Nonprofit Programs Director here at Spur Local. Today we're going to be talking about donor newsletters and how to craft an engaging donor newsletter. I'll be discussing both thinking about your audience and the folks that receive your current newsletter, ways to think about your audience if you are thinking about starting a donor newsletter, as well as going through some tips for what to include, and then finally going through some ways to kind of evaluate and track progress and see if you are getting that engagement that you're looking for. Today's webinar is geared towards anyone who's thinking about that donor newsletter, whether you already have one and you are thinking about taking it to the next level, activating your donors either to take action, volunteering, coming to events, or donating more regularly, or if you are thinking about starting a donor newsletter this year. It's something you've thought about. Maybe you have a newsletter geared towards the general audience and you're really thinking of shifting it. So we have a little bit of everything for everyone. That being said, we will be sharing the recording from today's webinar as well as the slides following today's session. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to go ahead and put them in the question box. On GoToWebinar, that just looks like a chat box with a question mark in the inside of it. Feel free at any point to drop in any questions you might have for me, and then I will have some time at the end for us to get into questions that you might have. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump right into things. So the first tip that we'll start with as you're thinking about this is really to know your audience and know who drives what. So as we're thinking about this, we're really thinking about our primary audience, which is the target audience that you currently are communicating with. So thinking about some key indicators of who this audience is. Much like a donor persona, as you're putting together who your key donor is, some of their characteristics, where do they work, where do they live, what do they engage in, who are in their networks. We're really thinking about this too in terms of our newsletter. So who are the folks who we want, who we're currently communicating with, and who is our primary audience of our newsletter? Knowing this and kind of going through, again, defining who this person is, this ideal person that's receiving this, interacting with this newsletter, is really helpful for us as we start to craft exactly the content that we want to create, and then also the activations that we'll be hoping to have our donors and newsletter recipients kind of take. So as you do this, what we recommend here is, if you already have a newsletter, just learning a little bit more about who you're currently sending to. This may be a diverse list. We hear from a lot of our partners that they have a newsletter that goes out regularly, but it includes maybe a mix of donors, a mix of volunteers, maybe even a mix of other folks who maybe recipients of your programs. And so kind of looking at your current list of folks on your newsletter list will help you kind of determine, okay, who do we currently have? And of this, who do we want to make sure that we're continuing to engage? And especially if you're thinking about shifting this newsletter and really honing in on the audience that you're thinking about communicating with. So just as you're thinking about this, again, just taking a look at the list of folks you currently have on your newsletter list. If you have a newsletter, taking a look at who's on it, maybe what are some of their core identities. One, this might help you identify, okay, if you have a large majority of volunteers on your list, okay, do you want them to be donors? If so, kind of including them on this list, kind of trying to just like move them forward into that donation space. But also if you realize you have a full list of volunteers and that's everyone who's on your newsletter list currently, you may want to think about separating that audience out and doing two separate newsletters because we want to make sure volunteers are getting volunteer information and that you are, again, this is specifically focused towards creating that donor newsletter. So just again, as we're thinking about this, you both want to define who you're looking to have, but also taking a look at who you currently have before you start to send this out. As you do this, kind of that primary audience, again, who you're currently communicating with, like thinking about that, but the ultimate goal here is just thinking about who's your goal audience. Ideally, you know who you already have on your list or who you maybe are communicating with regularly, but understanding who, taking a little bit of time either with your executive director, your communications manager, just to think about who is the audience you want to be communicating with. Again, similar to when we're thinking about our donor personas, who are we in our social media, community that we create, who do we want to have? Who do we want to be communicating with? What are some key characteristics? And with this in mind, starting to build content that they will like, even if they're not there now. Kind of going back to that volunteer example, if maybe we realize that our current list on our newsletter is 20% volunteers, maybe it's at that point 80% of our donors. That's great starting point there. Making sure that whoever our ideal audience is, that we're making the content, and I'll go into specific content to be thinking about, but starting to create that content, starting to publish that content in your newsletter, even if that isn't your goal audience. Maybe you want it to be 100% donors. Maybe you're at that 40-60 split, and you're really trying to get more donors on the list than other folks in your network. You want this, again, to be that donor newsletter. So thinking about building content specific to the donors, specific to the personas and folks and their interests with your organization, even if they aren't that audience that you currently have, really, again, trying to cater to who this ideal audience is there. Of course, as you're making the shift, you may want to do it in waves so it doesn't go fully. If it's just an informative newsletter to a donor newsletter, that you're losing everyone in that process, but really thinking about who is your goal audience, thinking about that piece. And then finally, as you're making this transition, if it makes sense for your group, if you feel like you have strong audience feedback, just asking audience what they want or who they are. And surveys can be a quick tool for this. We recommend not anything too long, maybe 5 to 6 questions, just sharing, giving your newsletter audience an opportunity to share what they're hoping to get out of the newsletter, maybe who they are, how they know about your organization, what they've engaged with your organization in the past, so you kind of know exactly what content to be putting in this. So overall, lots of different ways to be thinking about this, but what I recommend in terms of tip 1 here, again, knowing your audience, is taking a look first at who you currently have on your newsletter list, if you have that newsletter list already, seeing about who that audience is, and then also defining who do you want this audience to be. Taking a look at both of those will help us kind of narrow the gap between, again, those that we currently have, those that we want to be, and can also help us decide if we want to be moving into a full donor newsletter, or if we're maybe just kind of separating out lists there because we realize maybe we have a couple different listservs that we're using for different purposes. Tip number 2 is to create expectations. So say we've defined exactly who we want. We started to migrate people out of our newsletter list, started publishing, maybe posting about it more regularly, so people know that we do have a newsletter, that they can get involved and understand more about our organization. The next piece here is to create those expectations. So as we bring people into the fold, new folks, or as we're transitioning, again, making this whatever our newsletter is into a specific to donor newsletter, it's just thinking about building out some regular pieces. So as we're thinking about this, a couple different ways that you can create some expectations. One is around the title, and then another is around the timing, and then finally the format. So as we're thinking about this, titles can be helpful just to give your newsletter a name. Same convention, new details. So what this can be, example here is Spur Local Update, Nonprofits Prep for Summer Fun. You could have the Spur Local Update, fall festivities at the organization. So just taking a standard, making sure that you have that title that goes along with it, just can help create consistency in an inbox, especially if you're maybe starting to include donors that you haven't engaged with in recent years. Again, maybe your newsletter was dormant for a little bit. Just having that regular title showing up in someone's inbox creates that familiarity of your organization, that you're kind of top of mind for them. Something catchy, something that also speaks to the content in it. So that's one way to create those expectations. Another piece is creating out, sending it on standard intervals. So either at the same time, say same day and time of day, or creating it, monthly, bi-monthly, or quarterly. What we see a lot of nonprofits, especially if you are starting a donor newsletter, start with is that monthly newsletter and updates. If that feels like a lot and your capacity isn't able to take on that monthly piece, you could think of it being a quarterly newsletter. So just some ways to be thinking about it. You want it to be consistent, whatever timing you do decide. So again, that people kind of are expecting it or they're regularly seeing it in their inbox. The one thing I would caution against quarterly is, especially if you're starting it up, quarterly may be tough for people. Isn't necessarily creating that recognition because a new, multiple months go on in between receiving it for maybe the first and second time. So as you're able to, the more regular, the better. Again, kind of going to that monthly, bi-monthly, or quarterly basis here. And then finally, as you're thinking about this, thinking about a standard format. So readers know what to expect, especially if you're creating out specific sections of your newsletter, maybe volunteer opportunities, events, calls out to donate, ways to share information. Having that standard look and feel and similar types of content help, again, create expectations, but also allow for easier sharing and dissemination of information. So if I'm a donor receiving your newsletter and I know every single time at the end you'll have your volunteer opportunities, maybe when I'm thinking about my volunteer opportunities for the spring, I go straight to your newsletter and I know right at the bottom, that's where I'll always be able to see them. Or maybe I'm asked in a different organization, hey, do you know of volunteer opportunities in community? I go back to your newsletter and I know that anytime I open it, I'll see those volunteer opportunities. So just creating, again, a consistent look and feel, similar types of content. Really what we recommend here is that the newness should be in the details of photos and text that you use, but not in the format altogether. Again, especially as we're working to create that consistency so people know what to expect, really important to create a pretty standard format. Of course, as new events come up, as we may try new things, you may try out new formats, but just generally, as you're creating that consistency, you want to stick to similar types of content there. As you create that, one way to be thinking about this, tip number 3, is to vary the content that you're sharing. So a little bit of something for everyone. So as you're thinking about either building this out or, again, taking it to the next level, here's a couple suggestions for content that you could include in your newsletter. So one would be around impact. So thinking about, stories from your work, balancing client and program narratives. We know that client stories get the best engagement and should be first most of the time, but also sharing information about your program. So as you speak about your impact, what you could do as you're planning out maybe your communications calendar, your development calendar for the year, is plan out for when you may need to be collecting client stories and which client stories you're going to feature when. Really great here, again, especially thinking about building trust with our donors, thinking about how do we let them feel a part of the organization, how do we bring them into the fold, understand their impact. Those client stories are really powerful. So thinking about how do we each month that we're doing our newsletter share a bit of impact. Again, this might be a favorite feature that we might have a client testimonial each time opening this up, or a client story that we're able to share. So again, as you think about this, if we are planning for monthly newsletters, we just recommend taking some time at the beginning of the year here just to develop your process for either collecting stories, organizing your stories, and just having them ready to go so that each month it doesn't become that barrier to kind of putting together this piece. Again, you could also put in program stats, especially as we end your fiscal year and you might have an annual report or an annual one pager, using some of those stats and some of those graphics that you may be putting together already for social media, putting them into your newsletter and using that to share about the impact that donors have made at your organization. Another piece that you can highlight as you're thinking about this is some internal updates for your organization. So this could be a staff highlight, again, maybe that program highlight, could be about some organizational history, especially if you maybe you're running an anniversary year, or an award that you potentially received or that someone in your organization received. Here, this is the goal of this piece, is just to make it feel like an insider look. So gives, again, donors not only understanding the impact of your work and feeling like a part of your organization, but feeling like they really know who's behind, the face of your organization. So better understanding your work, again, that insider feel, that exclusive, who's doing the work, who do they get to, maybe they see the name in their inbox all the time, but they don't necessarily put a face to a name. Maybe they're not necessarily seeing you at events. So being able to give donors that feeling of, hey, you're important to us and we're sharing to you what's important to our organization, which are the people. So could be one thing that you focus on, it depends on your organization, if this makes sense, and kind of, again, who you're sending this out to. If you do decide to include any internal information, we just recommend keeping it short. Again, the main focus should be around impact and community, not necessarily those internal updates, but would recommend that if you're kind of, again, looking to kind of create more trust or kind of open up your organization to your donors if you haven't in the past. Another piece here is just thinking about your community. This is something external to the organization. This could be a donor or volunteer spotlight, maybe a partner event, sharing about your community history, or information about your social issue. So as you're thinking about the community piece, the goal of this part of your newsletter is really to be thinking about how do you make the donors, again, feel not just a part of your organization, but part of the greater goal that you're working towards. So sharing maybe community news, this could be something that your program has accomplished, ways you've been recognized in the community. Could be a piece, again, about community history, how you got to where you are currently, maybe current the current atmosphere or current events of the organization or related to your mission focus area. Could also be, in addition or separately, a donor or volunteer spotlight. So again, connecting them, okay, this person is we're highlighting them because they've made X number of years of impact at our organization. That they've been able to attend this many events or they've volunteered in this capacity. So sharing that can also kind of, again, connect folks, make them feel like they're part of that larger donor or volunteer community, potentially be more inclined to go to events to meet the folks that they're seeing in this newsletter, but also showcases the recognition that you have for those that are taking the time to donate their time and money or resources to your organization. So overall, as you're thinking about this, you may already include all three aspects here, but just included a couple additional suggestions in case you're kind of thinking or you feel like this piece of your newsletter might need to be updated. Tip number 4 here is to be active, so engaging your audience. So there's a couple different ways. So we've shared information, kind of varied the content of who we're highlighting, what we're highlighting. Another way to be thinking about your content is how to activate your audience. So this could be something that is more of a joining action. So maybe you're asking your audience to come to an event. This could be a community event or it could be your event. So if you feel like there's events that might be relevant to your audience that are not events that you as an organization host, maybe you have an event spotlight or in the community this week or in the community this month, and you are highlighting events that might be relevant for your audience. Again, trying to create that larger network of impact there. There's also a great chance just to highlight small activations you're doing. If you're going to be tabling at a fair, or if you're going to be showing up at an expo, or you're going to be highlighted at an event that is open to the public, this is a great place to just kind of share, see who you can get from your community to attend to that. If there are virtual or in-person options for this, you can certainly include those, but just as just one piece, again, to have folks coming to those events. It could be your event, could be others' event, but just a way to kind of create that more of a community event board there. The other action here is do, so asking an audience to take an action. So this could be to donate, to volunteer, or any personal actions with your organization. Ideally, when you are creating this newsletter, you are avoiding active solicitations in most newsletters. You may have a piece at the bottom or a donate today button included in your newsletter. You may have, if you're interested in visiting our website to learn more and make a donation, like having a link to that in your in your newsletter. But the goal of these newsletters is really to build that community, inform folks, and really prep them for when you do solicit them separately, during a campaign or as you're reaching out to donors individually. So the goal of our donor newsletter isn't necessarily to actively solicit donations. So as you're thinking about the actions that donors can take, this could be, again, donating, again, if you're a part of a campaign, it's end of year, it is an anniversary, it is maybe an awareness month for your organization. Could also be that volunteer. What do you want them to volunteer for? What event you want them to go to, or any personal actions, that could be in this advocate bucket, what I'll get into in a moment, or if you want them just to be sharing more broadly about your organization. In terms of advocating, there's another piece, again, thinking about how to engage your audience is asking your audience to share your message. So this could be formal advocacy, personal advocacy, or self-advocacy. Self-advocacy is really just learning more. Maybe you have an article that you published or a blog post, or you've come across an article or a study specific to the work that you do, and you just want your organization to, your community of donors to learn a little bit more about your organization. So maybe you're sharing that. So really just thinking, if you have a piece or you are actively reviewing different literature or current events, could be, hey, this is what we've been reading or what we've been thinking about. Having a portion of this in your newsletter so that folks can kind of take the time after reading your newsletter to reflect, maybe share with a friend. That personal piece is sharing with a friend. So again, formal advocacy, if there are opportunities for that with your organization, certainly you can put in those opportunities. Again, that self-advocacy, what can people do outside of formally sharing or with their personal networks or kind of taking time to learn themselves. Or personal advocacy is sharing with a friend. So maybe it's, hey, we have this volunteer opportunity. We encourage you to share this with your friends and bring 1 to 2 folks to this. Or, hey, as you read this article, we'd really appreciate if you share it with some people you think would find the matter interesting. So, or share with people in this neighborhood if you know people in this neighborhood that we work in. So as you're thinking about advocacy, this again, don't feel like all of these pieces you have to include in every single newsletter. That would be one packed newsletter, but really just offering these as ways to be thinking about how do you think about your activation each time. So what are you hoping to kind of get your donors to do so that they're kind of regularly both reading about your organization, feeling updated, and then also having opportunities to engage so that, again, when we come time to make donations, when we are soliciting, making those formal asks, they're prepped and feeling that they are, again, part of that community. And then tip number 5 is, so as you are doing this or putting together this newsletter, including all the different pieces here, is just to track data. So learning as you go, because if we're putting the time into this, we want to make sure that it's effective. So what we're thinking here, I have a couple different options or ways to think about your data. Don't feel like you have to do all these, especially if you aren't currently tracking data, but here are just some options as you think about what impact you're making. So one is taking a look at your open rate. So that's how many people opened the last email that was sent. What this tells us is what is our engagement? Maybe this tells us about the quality of our title, who's sending it, really just that top line high level highlight. It doesn't tell us too much there, but as we're thinking about our open rate, again, we might want to experiment with our titles, especially if we are naming it that consistent title and kind of moving to that. Could also be experimenting with sender. Maybe it's coming from we know that you're seeing that your communications manager is the one sending out the emails. If people aren't as familiar with that person, maybe you're noticing that if the ED sends it out or it comes from what looks like the ED's email, maybe you're having a higher open rate. Maybe it's also, again, that quality title. Is it catching to people? Are people going to open that? So generally, just want to experience a little bit or to experiment a little bit with that. But the open rate is really that high level quick look at who's engaging. If you notice that's low, just keep sending and experiment with that sender and subject. Again, one at a time. You don't want to try to change everything at once or you won't be able to tell which is working and what isn't. What your aim should be generally here is to get at least 20% or higher open rate. Outside of the open rate, another metric you can track here is click-through. So that's how many people that opened your email then clicked a link in it. What this tells you is more information about the content and audience activation. So is the content resonating with what folks? So as we're thinking about the ideal audience that we are hoping to get, are people who are in our ideal kind of audience demographic, are they clicking through these links? Is the content engaging them? If our goal is activation, we have a lot of opportunities for volunteers, events, advocacy. We really want our community to learn a lot more about the history of our work and the implications of it. If folks aren't clicking through that, kind of just thinking about how do we want to reframe this? How do we want to get people engaged in it? So what you can do here is just watch for what links will get clicked over time. Typically, we see low percentages on the click-through rate, but they, again, are more telling if you're seeing that, hey, every single link that I link maybe to a client story or a blog each time, everyone's clicking that. Okay, so if they're seeing that maybe that client interview or client blog story that we're putting out, that means that that's resonating really well. or you're always seeing, even though low, event registration, the event registration link clicked. Okay, then this is a really great forum for activating our audience to attend things. Our community is pretty active in their attendance. So really just taking a look at what you are seeing. Can you include more of that, again, to make it feel worthwhile in the newsletter? And then finally, the other piece here that we just recommend looking at is your unsubscribe rate. So that's how many people remove themselves from your email list. This is usually an indication that frequency is too high, but it's not always your fault. We all are inundated with information. It's not that folks are seeing your email every time, but 1 week they may see it, kind of just X out, delete that email. The next week they may realize, hey, I'm actually looking at my emails. This isn't relevant to me anymore. So we can't necessarily control that. It just usually, I would say, is an indication that frequency is too high. But taking a look at that, especially as we're switching over our newsletter, if we aren't switching anything, we're trying new things, we're seeing unsubscribe, then it might be the content there. But just taking a look at that, taking it with a grain of salt, and just looking at any changes you made from one email to the other to see what might be the change. Wouldn't recommend using this as your end-all be-all indicator of what to change, but just another piece, especially as you're looking at the open rate and click-through rate, another piece of data to be looking at as you decide what to include. All right, I talked through a lot and pretty quickly through that, all the different high-level tips there. If you're thinking about what to do now, I have kind of 6 things to be thinking about. So one is just knowing who your audience is. So taking some time this week or this month to look at who your current audience is and who you want it to be. If you are thinking about starting a newsletter, it's not something maybe you've done in the past, thinking about who is your ideal audience and how do you get them subscribed to your newsletter. After you've done that, scheduling a regular time for your newsletter. So does that make sense for your organization monthly? Who at your organization might need to be involved to be able to put this out on a monthly basis? What information will you need? What does that schedule kind of process of putting together the newsletter look like? 3 is just thinking about setting expectations whenever possible. Again, consistent title, consistent sender, or consistent timing. Finally, just planning content for the next couple of issues. Again, just getting that events calendar set up if you are planning to share events, making sure that there are consistent features that you're doing, or if you need those client stories, just having a couple of those written up so it makes it a little bit easier for you to put together that newsletter. 5, just taking a look and updating practices based on data over time, what you're seeing works. Also just taking a look at your current newsletter and doing a quick update of what the content is. Doesn't need a refresh. And then finally, experimenting, especially if you are launching for the first time, you may not get it right on that first go. So thinking about who's the sender, who's the title, and what content we're creating. Ultimately, you have a lot of people in your network that are engaged. And so the goal of this donor newsletter is to make sure that we're building that community, that people are feeling engaged, that they know what's going on, and they know how to get engaged with our organization outside of donating, so that when it comes time to make those more monetary asks or those asks for time, that people are fully aware of what's happening, or they've had the opportunity to be fully aware. They feel like that we have been on their mind and we care about them as donors. So it's a bit of the cultivation and stewardship in preparation for that solicitation. So with that, we have a couple minutes here. I'll pause to see if any questions. So if you have any, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat. It does look like a question box with a chat box with a question mark in it. Someone just asked if it's being recorded. Yes, this webinar is recorded. We will be sending out the slides and the recording after today's session. All right, I'm seeing a couple people typing in here. I'll give you a second more to go ahead and put in a question, and then if you have any others after today, I can go ahead and follow up with you offline. one question here in terms of, do you have any recommendations on the format, videos, photos, or plain? Recommend having at least one photo or piece of kind of visual content per newsletter as you're putting this together, especially if you have, this is a great place if you have event photos or you're able to share any client photos or work or maybe a volunteer spotlight, just having at least one visual piece of content. This also allows, if you're putting together that visual content, for you to kind of cross promote maybe on your social channels. Hey, if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, here's who we're highlighting. Or here's the stat that we released in our newsletter. So having a video or a photo in your newsletter each time, really great way to have that. And I saw someone also put here in the chat that their engagement has increased since they've increased the photos. So that's great. Thank you, Denise, for sharing that there. And then thinking through, what advice do you have for newsletters that have low click rate and low open rates to the links offered? I feel like we usually have a lot of opportunities for engagement, but not many folks click on them. So what I recommend there is just taking a look at the types of links that you're offering and the way that you're highlighting it. So maybe you might want to be thinking about promoting having some of your links for events at the top of the newsletter if you feel like maybe they're buried at the bottom. Could also be thinking about the types of events. Are they events that require a fee? Are they only volunteer events? Do you need to be a certain age or have a certain experience? What neighborhoods are they in? Thinking about which ones are getting that click-through rate. Could you be promoting more of those? So just taking a look at the types of links you're sharing, seeing if there's any commonalities in terms of the audiences that they're recruiting. That would be one piece. Also, if you're thinking about it, are there any ways that you can, maybe if it's an event, there is a paid piece, is there a discount that organization would offer for folks who come through your newsletter? Is that something you can offer for the exclusivity piece of it? And then finally, another thing you can be thinking about is just reducing the number of links to make it feel like you're really highlighting the core opportunities there. And then thinking about how can you analyze info, read donor newsletters without sending those asks. So thinking about, you would need to have some sort of activation there. If you're sending it through MailChimp, you'll be able to have the info, or any other donor newsletter platform, have the information of your donors who's opening and clicking through that. So you could see a little bit more there. If you are making an app, if you don't know who exactly is on your newsletter and you don't have a way in your current platform, what we would recommend is having a quick survey of who's reading this newsletter. What are you interested in seeing? How have you engaged with us in the past? Maybe doing a quick one to get that information about them. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't have that information top of mind here, or top of hand. All right. Thanks all for being here. I know we're over time. If you have any other questions that I didn't get to them, I'll go ahead and follow up with you offline to get you some more information, but really appreciate you being here. Like I said, I see a couple more here that I wasn't able to get to, so I will follow up with you. And if there's any common questions, I'll make sure I share that in the follow-up so we all get the information. But thanks all for being here. Really appreciate it, and have a great day.